All right. So, second part of chapter 16 in Foner's Give Me Liberty, the transformation of the American West. This image is an image of Sitting Bull. It's one of the most well-known images of him. He was one of the few Native Americans in the 19th century that was widely photographed, one of the most photographed people in the 19th century overall, I would say. And this is a photograph that he was willing to give and willing to sell. And he sold these photographs as souvenirs when he toured with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And I'm going to say more about that at the end of this talk, but to think about this process where Sitting Bull becomes a kind of celebrity and becomes a person who is photographed as a souvenir in a performance of the kind of historic so-called Wild West. How that happens is kind of the theme of this talk, and a symbol really of how the American West transformed in the late 19th century. So I'm going to start talking about, and this again is mentioned in Foner as well, of Frederick Jackson Turner, who is a historian who actually was giving his lecture right kind of across the street from Buffalo Bill's shows. He gave a thesis that's called the Frontier Thesis. And he gave this in 1893. And it's at this point that he says, okay, we have approached this transformative moment in American history. The frontier is gone. And he meant by that he defined the frontier as that kind of line between sort of white settlers and the land that was still controlled by indigenous peoples that hadn't been inhabited by white settlers yet. And he's saying by 1893, that frontier that essentially had been moving across from the Atlantic Ocean, way back in the country's origins, to the Pacific Ocean, that era has ended. He talked about the virtues of white settlement and how, for him, one of the most important things was that process of what he called kind of taming the frontier was really important to the kind of building of white Americans' character. It made white Americans into Americans. They moved from being Europeans to being Americans in that process of kind of encountering the wilderness and settling the wilderness and doing the kind of hard work involved in establishing these settlements. And he talked about it as if it is this kind of peaceful, orderly process. And you can see a kind of romantic representation of that in this painting that's in the background, right? Of this kind of orderly procession of settlers going across the mountains and the plains. And he said this process is really the core of he didn't use the term Anglo-American, I'm using that term, but really the core of what he called just American identity. And this thesis became widely circulated and really was kind of a dominant way of understanding American history for a long, long time. It's only later that idea gets challenged. And I want to say just a little bit more about the kinds of things that were facilitating this. So we already talked a little bit about, the expansion of the railroad. Well, this is particularly transformative in the West. Just 4 years after the Civil War, 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. So keep in mind that before that, you had two sort of rail lines one coming from California to the east and one coming from the east to the west. And when they meet at Promontory Point, that is, they put that last spike down in 1869. Now you have a railroad that officially goes, across the entire country. And lots of other rail lines, going across various other parts of the West and also really through the South as well, which didn't have quite as much railroad development until after the Civil War. So all of these networks really help facilitate even more white settlement into territories that they previously had not inhabited. And this is another kind of idealized picture of, and the kind of promises that the railroad would bring. So you see all of these folks here kind of eagerly waiting for the train to come. It helped, of course, transport them other places. It helped make more goods accessible so they could get things that were from the east. It would come on these rail cars. So they got all the kind of amenities of more settled places further east through the expansion of the railroad. You also had things like the Homestead Act that was initially signed in 1862. Again, a lot of these things kind of happen in the midst of the Civil War, and then they kind of come to sort of culminate after the war. And this was a great opportunity for a number of Americans, particularly white Americans. There were some Black Americans that also were able to take advantage of the Homestead Act to a more limited degree. But this said that any U.S. citizen who had not borne arms against the government, and that I think they that was tells you something about they didn't. This was particularly kind of for Northerners. You would be eligible to 160 acres of land that was already surveyed, but then you had to kind of live on that land for 5 years. You had to improve it, meaning you had to, grow crops, sell those crops, be able to sustain yourself. And if you could do that, then you could kind of continue your claim on that land. And this image here is of a kind of sod house. This was one of the most common kinds of buildings that a lot of these settlers would create on these wide open plains. But doing this was incredibly difficult, and for a lot of people. So by the turn of the century, you only have about 52% finally acquire the legal title because they've managed to prosper enough in those 5 years, and the other half didn't. So this was much more difficult to achieve in reality, but it was certainly an opportunity that lots of Americans took advantage of. And there were other programs as well offered by railroad companies who had already been given these generous land grants. They started to sell it off to individual farmers. And so it just really, really exponentially increased white Western settlement. So keep in mind, while the kind of in the East, you have these growing urban areas, you have a kind of the agrarian republic hasn't really disappeared, but it's sort of moving further west. You also have more locally in Texas, and then going north from Texas through Kansas, you have the cattle drives and the cattle kingdom. And so the rail lines also kind of increase this as later on, but you get cowboys, right? These who are kind of romanticized as these sort of independent individuals, but who were also really kind of working class wage laborers. They were a multi-ethnic group. You had Black cowboys, you had Mexicano cowboys, you had white cowboys, and they often kind of, it was in many ways a more kind of, among cowboys themselves, it was more egalitarian. There weren't a lot of big differentiations among these kind of big group of wage laborers. And it was a very, very hard kind of work to do. but it, you know, became later the part of a lot of kind of Western mythology, as I'm sure you're well aware. And then you have the kind of downside again. So in some ways, this lecture is like the previous one. You have sort of the kind of utopian imaginings of the possibilities of these big changes. But you also have these kind of dystopian realities that historians are talking about a lot more now than they used to. One of the things is that, you know, as all of this is happening, and particularly as the railroad is expanding, you have the decline of the buffalo or the bison. So these were these great herds that, of course, roamed across the plains. Railroads, other settlements kind of disrupt their migrations. And you also had, you know, the railroad companies in particular had kind of an interest in decimating these herds. So you could go on a trip on the railroad cars, and you could have a group of hunters that would take their rifles, and they would they would ride in the cars, and they would shoot from the cars to this big herd of buffalo, and they managed to essentially kill a lot of them pretty efficiently. And they started to profit from their hides as well. And so as that kind of trade increased, that the population of buffalo just decreased dramatically. So you essentially have the almost the complete extinction of the buffalo in the 19th century. And these numbers that you can see here make that pretty clear, right? So you've got 40 million in 1800. 50 years later, that's decreased by half. And then after 1850, it gets even more dramatic. To 1885, you've only got 20,000 left. Ultimately, 1902, you've got 23 wild bison left. I don't know who created that number, but I've seen it in lots of different historical texts. Now, after that, in the 20th century, there are some efforts to kind of revive some bison populations so that they are not extinct today, but they're definitely in much smaller numbers, and they're kind of limited essentially to preserves and national parks. And this also, of course, had this very, very drastic implications for indigenous peoples who relied on the buffalo for their livelihood, for their food, for their housing, for their culture. You know, all of the indigenous peoples of the plains really, really suffered because of the decline of the buffalo. And this was, of course, part of a longer process of since really white arrival to the Americas, the containment and the kind of genocide against indigenous peoples. In the late 19th century, this gets more aggressive, essentially. So you have in 1851, there's this doctrine calling for the kind of concentration and incorporation of indigenous peoples. And there were a series of treaties. This is from the very beginning of US history. You have these series of treaties that are kind of making these negotiations with indigenous peoples. And those were problematic enough. You know, a lot of those treaties were made and then quickly violated. Some of those treaties already involved huge concessions. And so a lot of land was lost in that overall process. But in 1871, Congress essentially suspends treaty making altogether, and we move more to a system of forcing indigenous peoples off their land onto what was called reservations. That didn't begin in 1871, but it certainly kind of intensifies after 1871. So this map, you could just watch the time lapse. You can see, of course, these indigenous lands, how they get decreased through the 19th century, going to the present reservation system today. I thought that was a nice illustration of that to look at. One of the most significant pieces of legislation that exacerbated this was called the Dawes Act. And this was this shift from, okay, so before you had reservations where you would say the whole tribe could kind of have communal ownership of land, and that was more consistent with the way that a lot of indigenous peoples lived, and certainly the way they considered land. They didn't own individual plots. They utilized the land as a group, right? But for white Americans who really wanted to essentially forcibly assimilate Native Americans into white culture, they said, no, what we really need to do is have indigenous peoples become essentially white farmers. And so we're going to take all that land that they had a claim to, and we're going to divide it up into these individual allotments. And not surprisingly, even that land, it wasn't all of that land that they had owned. Instead, they took 47 million acres of that and apportioned it, said, okay, each of those, that's a good allotment for an individual family. But look, you've got, 90 million acres left over. That can be sold to all sorts of other folks, to white farmers, to railroads, to land speculators. So in that process, a lot of that land that was controlled by indigenous peoples is lost. And then the efforts to really forcibly assimilate indigenous peoples was even more drastic. It wasn't just about land, it was also about really eradicating indigenous cultures. And so what the federal government started to do, so there were some of these policies before this, but really this accelerated in about 1869. The federal government and a number of Christian denominations also created these Indian boarding schools. And the official policy of these schools essentially was, as one said, to kill the Indian, save the man. So they really believed that eradicating indigenous culture was a way of preserving the people. They saw these indigenous practices as a kind of threat, not only to themselves, but to indigenous peoples themselves. It was, of course, a deeply kind of patronizing kind of perspective, but it was this idea that they would be better off if they adopted our way of life, so to speak. So they forcibly remove children from their homes and relocate them often to schools that were often far away from their families. And this accelerates actually well into the 20th century. This goes on until kind of the mid 20th century. And some of these boarding schools still exist. Their policies are certainly not as not forced in the way that they used to be, but a lot of indigenous peoples, you still have a lot of oral histories of people who remember being taken from their homes and kind of having their culture kind of eradicated. So they were punished for speaking their native language. They had to often cut their hair. They had to wear kind of Western clothing. And many of them suffered physical, sexual, cultural, and spiritual abuse and neglect. Just this past year, they uncovered these sort of unmarked graves in Canada from an Indian boarding school. A lot of the kind of fates of individual children that were lost were not known because a lot of them weren't able to kind of successfully reunite with their families after they were in school. And the ones who were often found they were kind of alienated because they would come back and they couldn't speak the language of their parents and their grandparents, and so it was an incredibly abusive and horrific practice that unfortunately has a very, very long history that we are just, I think, now starting to reckon with in our kind of broader narratives. But it came from the belief that indigenous cultures were a thing, needed to be a thing of the past. So this gets to Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And one of the most interesting things about these shows, they happened, as you see here, but at the kind of end of the 19th and then early 20th century. And they were led by this kind of showman, Buffalo Bill, who, became one of the biggest celebrities of his time. He, it's hard to overestimate how influential these Wild West shows were. They traveled on the railroad, kind of went through various cities and towns, and they always had these kind of big sold out performances. But what Buffalo Bill did is he essentially was sort of recreating a kind of nostalgic view of what he called the Wild West, right? The West before white folks came. And when you had indigenous peoples who were freely roaming, and you had buffalo who were freely roaming the plains. And even though a lot of these performances were talking about violent attacks, they also, in some interesting way, were kind of celebrating indigenous cultures. It was a kind of what some people have called imperialist nostalgia. So it's when the kind of power, the people who are the ones who have kind of taken something, they've kind of stolen land or stolen culture, then they go and they kind of celebrate what was lost, before it was stolen. This is another kind of poster from one of the most popular of the Wild West performances, which was a performance of Custer's Last Stand. So Foner talks about this historical event quite a bit, but if you remember, there is the Battle of Little Bighorn was actually one of the few great kind of triumphs of the Sioux who defeated Custer's army. And, it was a stunning defeat. All of the U.S. cavalry were killed, including Custer himself. The federal response to that, unfortunately, is brutal. It kind of exacerbates the pursuit of the Sioux in particular. And so by 1890, you have the Wounded Knee, and you have the kind of decimation of the Sioux that follows this. But for a lot of white Americans, that Custer's Last Stand it's kind of like it's another version of the Alamo. So it's that idea of kind of Anglo martyrdom, that you've got this sort of force that and the kind of necessary sacrifice of Anglo heroes that then sets the stage for Anglo civilization. And Buffalo Bill had lots of, this was the most popular kind of performance that he had, and he liked himself to play Custer. And as it says here, it displays a kind of inversion of really what was happening, what was actually happening historically. So it's portraying white Americans as kind of the victims of this sort of attack. But really, when you look at the broader history, it's really indigenous peoples who are being killed and displaced, and their culture that's being destroyed. But this is a performance of kind of white victimhood, and a kind of, in some ways, a way of justifying the white settlement that follows. And oddly enough, it kind of romanticizes indigenous cultures, as I said before. And one of the most interesting aspects of the Wild West shows is that Buffalo Bill liked to recruit indigenous performers because for him, it of course added more quote unquote authenticity, right? If you had real people, real indigenous people playing themselves, that made it a bigger draw. Um, and, some viewed that as exploitative, understandably so. But for a number of indigenous performers, in some ways, this was, if your other alternative is the boarding school, here you have this space where at least you don't have to cut your hair and you can wear your traditional clothing and you can engage in your traditional practices, and you're actually going to have a space where, even in this kind of distorted way, it's celebrated more than the alternative. And so for that reason, you do have a number of indigenous people who agreed to tour with the show, including Sitting Bull, who had been particularly famous for his legendary kind of defiance of the U.S. Army. He was this legendary Sioux leader, and he actually had a close friendship with Buffalo Bill, because even though Buffalo Bill is kind of portraying this narrative, he formed a close friendship with a number of the performers who worked with him. And at the end of when Sitting Bull was ultimately killed by federal troops, Buffalo Bill did try before that to kind of intervene, to try to kind of negotiate, to try to save his life. He was not successful in doing so, but it shows the extent to which there was a sincere friendship between the two people. But think back to that image of the of Buffalo Bill on the postcard, and you can kind of see this is that encapsulates the transformation, right? The indigenous leaders who had controlled the plains were now kind of having to perform in these shows that were in some ways celebrating this kind of nostalgia, but also facilitating their demise. So that's the great kind of paradox of these kinds of shows. The other paradox I wanted to point out is, remember, when we talked about Reconstruction, we talked about a lot of people who worked in the Union troops, a lot of people who worked for the Freedmen's Bureau, and in many ways they were helping to liberate Black Americans. They were aiding in the liberation of a marginalized group. But those very same people would also go out and would capture, and would forcibly relocate indigenous people, including a lot of folks who worked for the Freedmen's Bureau. So the federal army, has this kind of contradictory role in this era. On the one hand, kind of aiding in the liberation of some groups, but also aiding in the genocide of another group.